No, no buzz. Just Be's book club. For today, it was in fact today, I read, well, The Gunslinger. Both versions. So The Gunslinger, first book in the Dark Tower series, one of my favorite series of all time. In my ongoing, following the wonderful critics over at Range Touch, their show Just King Things, which thing that one should immediately turn this off and go listen to instead because they're much more insightful and they think about these things instead of just doing it. I did a little bit more than just doing it this time. Yeah, I read The Gunslinger, the '88 publication trade paperback from Plume Books with the full color illustration, the Roland standing over the dead bodies of all the people. Tool, Hull, OLE. We got Roland in his Narcissus moment. Pretty fun little paint. We have also where's the little one pager with the slow mutants, Tug and Jake, and then finally, of course, Roland on the beach, the tower in the distance. One with the interstitial stuff. Then we also have so that one published in this version, or in this version in '88, I think. Stories initially from '78 to '81, and then the revised version that was put out in 2003, I want to say. This is my first time engaging with it. Yes, it was revised in 2003 as the final Dark Tower book was coming out. And I sort of fell into a pattern where I basically read more or less 30 pages of the unrevised copy, and then 30 pages, and then those same 30 pages in the revised copy. Which more or less, that was actually, what it actually was, I read the first 30 pages of the beginning of the book, which is the story called The Gunslinger, then to the other one, then finish The Gunslinger, and then I basically just went chapter by chapter, because then we have the way station, the slow mutants, no, sorry, the way station, the oracle in the mountain, the slow mutants, and what is the actual last one called? The Gunslinger and the Dark Man. I avoided the intro and after. I feel like reading them. And what were the other preliminary things that I was going to say? Yeah, story of a man who walks across a desert, finds a boy. In the meantime, reminisces about killing an entire town and his old life in the revised version that ends 12 years ago. Or sorry, in the pre-revised version that ends about 12 years ago, and the revised version that is maybe a century ago or more. So there's big lore differences in them, and that's sort of the broadly stated. The difference is the revision goes through, and King basically goes through and says, "Oh, I made names for these things. These animals are really important later, so they'll kind of pop up really quick here and there." Bumble Brazzers or whatever the fuck, Brumblers. Also, for context, hi, I'm B. If you're watching this, you're also a B, because it's the Just B's book club, and if you're not a B, you can't be watching this. I love The Dark Tower. I read it right around when all the books came out, and then I've read it again maybe twice since then. It was kind of my only Stephen King engagement, basically, until I started following the Range Touch's Just King Things. I read Cujo at some point. A coworker highly recommended the Girl Who Killed Tom Gordon, which I also really liked a lot, and then et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm reading through them in publication order, even though it took basically a year off to be able to just find both of these copies and then find the time to sit down and do the project that I wanted to do. I did not take notes. This is not a comprehensive, moment-by-moment discussion of every revision. I'm sure those exist on the internet, and I didn't want to do that. But I did want to see what the revisions were like, because I didn't do that with The Stand, and I kind of regretted it, because I think that book in the revised edition is bad. I think it's a bad, boring novel with the revisions, and I wanted to just give it a shot. And so I did, and I kind of also think that about the 2003 revisions. Frankly, um, there are a handful of good things. You know, there's some typos that are very glaring to get fixed in the 2003 edition. Um, None that are like important, but you know, seeing a typo and seeing it fixed is always nice, I guess. The other positives about the revision, I feel like immediately come to mind for sure. I feel like I had one while I was reading. I think there's like a handful of, and by a handful I mean maybe two times where like something that was not productively unclear in the '88 version was made clear by the 2003 version. I can't pull either off the top of my head. Again, this is not like a comprehensive breakdown, but otherwise, I think the revisions are basically all negative. It starts from the jump, so I'll look at that in a second. But like, functionally, the revisions are there to bring the lore, I guess, basically into line, right? Because King is writing these in 78 through 81. The Dark Tower isn't like at all even like it has a lot of the central ideas and some of the central themes, but like yeah, the backgrounds, the characters' last names, for instance, is a thing that gets like very aggressively added. There's a slight revision that like is I feel like pretty neutral at the very end of the book. This is going to be spoilers. Where in the original version, the big reveal or one of the big reveals is like is conversation at the end between the man in black and the gunslinger, right? And the big question Roland asks in that reveal, or that's like everything he's trying to ask is like, "Do I know you?" And the man in black is like, "You do, but from where? Can you not figure it out?" And the big reveal is that like the gunslinger has been thinking that this is a man named Martin from his past, who was like his father, the King Arthur, basically's um, uh, like right hand man, but who is like scheming, sort of a worm tonguey kind of thing is going on there. And so Gunslinger has been like thinking that this might be Martin, but actually it's Walter, who's like Martin's assistant. And that's like the big reveal. And then the other big reveal is that Walter is like being led along by Merlin. And in the revised version, Merlin gone completely. Walter is just like a different form Martin took on afterwards, not like a member of Martin's retinue actually like, guiding him behind. Because I think when he first wrote the book, he thought he was going to go in a Merlin and Walter direction, and then forgot about that at some point, and then so he came back and we'll just cut all that shit out. That's like a neutral thing, I think, ultimately to me. There's a lot of other stuff like that, a lot of uses of generic terms or mythological terms that get sort of just like shuffled off. Like there's one other one in that conversation. I'm just thinking about this because I read it a couple hours ago, right? But like, there's a line about like you will spend the rest of your life walking over the pit of hell. It turns into like you will spend the rest of your life walking over the pit of Naaz or something like that. Like it's just like we get colloquial terms for mythological things or religious images or whatever that turn into capital P, capital N, proper nouns in the lore, and I think that all is just makes this book worse. Those instances I think are actively bad, and I'll get into that in a second. Other things, very funnily, ages up Jake Chambers, the young boy that Roland finds in the Way Station, which is like ancient technology. There's something anyway. He ages him up a couple years. I think in the original he's 10. In the revised edition he's 12. And he also writes him much more childishly. So like the way it physically I would do this, right, is I would read the unrevised copy, get to about 30 pages in, or a chapter break, and then I'd put it on the ground in front of me, or on the table in front of me, or on the bench in front of me, wherever I was reading, and I'd pick up the revised edition and just go back through that exact same section and read the thing I had just read. And the reason I would put it on the table in front of me is because I would immediately start going like, is that how he phrased that in the last one? And I would flip back and I would take a look. And there were like 3 or 4 distinct instances where he specifically had Jake like say the same thing that he said in the original book, but then add another line that was basically him repeating himself petulantly. Which is what I mean when I say, despite being ostensibly an older kid, he reads as much younger. It's like, in the original he'll say like I don't want to do that, right? I'm just making up an example, right? Jake will respond to something Roland says with, I don't want to do that, right? In the revised edition, he'll respond with, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Like, literally often just reduplicating what he last said, or like slightly rephrasing it, if not perfectly reduplicating it. And it's annoying. It reads as very childish in a way that like the ostensibly 10-year-old Jake did not read as childish. And that's sort of the whole thing. But yeah, what's the other big point? I mean, like, let's see if I can just find a thing immediately, right? And while I'm doing that, I'm just actually, right before I do that, I just looked up an old blog post I wrote called The Liar Stephen King from 2016. I guess last time I read this book, The Gunslinger. And it was very funny in the context of this because for the thesis, it's a very colloquial blog post, is where I am saying that, like, I don't know that the thesis holds up, but the central thought experiment, right, is like, first line is, this is the most famous thing maybe Stephen King's ever written, or at least his favorite. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. And back in 2016, when I read it, and then read through the whole unrevised edition back then, I was like, that's a lie. Straight up. Like, everything that happens from the point that that sentence ends to the end of this book is indicating that the man in black is not fleeing. Like, Roland knows it by like less than halfway through the book. The man in black really knows it from the beginning. Like, the story is pointing that way within a couple of pages, but it stays the first line, I think, because Stephen King likes it and because it flows really well. But there's no fleeing happening in the man in black's part, even a little bit. Like, he is completely in control of the situation and like knows it. Roland knows it. Roland like comes and Roland like in the revised edition actually has a slightly less often remarked upon as being the most unimaginative man in like maybe history. It still comes up in the revised edition, but there's like a number of times where that like Roland's total and complete lack of imagination is just straight up like wiped from the book. The line is cut, not that it's wiped from the book, but like the line itself is cut, and I think that's actually another moment that's like pretty value neutral, I want to say, because yeah. But let's see the next line. I'm just gonna read the second paragraph of the original and the second paragraph of the and maybe a little bit more because I'm now remembering some things. So, unrevised. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what might have been parsecs in all directions. White, blinding, waterless, without feature save for the faint, cloudy haze of the mountains which sketched themselves on the horizon, the devil grass which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way, for once the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crusts of alkali had been a highway and coaches had followed it. The world had moved on since the world had emptied. Revised edition. First line, of course, is the same. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what looked like an eternity in all directions. It was white and blinding and waterless and without features save for the faint, cloudy haze of the mountains which sketched themselves on the horizon and the devil grass which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way, for once the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crusts of alkali had been a highway. Coaches and buckets had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied. Just like very basic stuff, right? Like that line, white semicolon, blinding semicolon, waterless semicolon, without feature, blah blah blah, turns into it was white and blinding and waterless and without feature. There's just like a complete abandonment of the poetry of language in favor of I guess clarity. What one would say, what I would say if I was doing copy edits on this, right? If you turn this into me and said make this more clear, I would probably change it to about what he did. I would also say this is worse. This is worse. This feels less interesting to read in the practice of reading. And then there's things like adding buckets because buckets come up in book 3 or whatever, right? And that's whatever. That's what the goal was, and like if that was all he did, I would still have problems with it, but I would not hate it, I guess, necessarily. But just constant, and it's really, really, really bad at the beginning. I feel like by the last couple of stories, it's mostly just sort of like inserting proper nouns in randomly. But like especially in the Gunslinger itself, the language is just made so much duller and more, efficient throughout all the revisions that it really bummed me out because like it's hard to get the unrevised version at this point, and I think it's just a better read as its own thing. Like I think it works better, and like this is my broad point, and this will be the big sort of thing, right? The Gunslinger Unrevised reads like a novel that is setting up a world. And that's what it is. It sets up the next 20 years of Stephen King, like the back of Stephen King's brain, right? It sets up a bunch of stuff, and some of those things go in different directions. The revised version feels like part 1 of a septet of novels, or of a septet novel, like he had written, or like he wants it to feel like he wrote the whole thing all at once. And I think that one is a lie, like obviously and clearly, and 2 fundamentally shifts what the Gunslinger is, because it turns it from this weird fucking thing that is it's a Western that's got Hey Jude all over it, that's like, occasionally spikes into like really gross, horrifying shit. A child death that is pretty intensely described. And like, but also like, did it toll like a lot. There's like moments of like spiking of horror. There's this underpinning of Western. There's these weird, vague gestures toward this high fantasy Arthurian thing that happened at some point that is weirdly spiked down at like 12 years ago at one point, and then he kind of just forgets about it again. Like, it's this mess of ideas that I think is a better representation of the Dark Tower series as a whole, and a better introduction to the Dark Tower series as a whole, than this weird lie that, like, this book is fundamentally compatible with the rest of them, which is what bringing in all the terminology, like right at the fucking jump. It's like page 2, maybe. Um, yeah, it's like he introduces the Manny like people who I don't even fucking remember. Instead of just letting it live, and yeah, and like that's a annoying one. But like, there's like a reference to his horn that is like, yeah, that's yeah. Let's do this again. Um, this is like one of the first descriptions of him, really early on. His clothes. This is again the unrevised version first. His clothes were the no color of rain or dust. His shirt was open at the throat, with a rawhide thong dangling loosely in hand-punched eyelets. His pants were seam-stretched dungarees. That's that paragraph in the original. His shirt, the no color of rain or dust, was opened at the throat with a rawhide thong dangling loosely in hand-punched eyelets. His hat was gone. So was the horn he had once carried. Gone for years, that horn, spilled from the hand of a dying friend, and he missed them both. What do you do with that? If this is the first time you're reading this, like, what do you do with that? It's like it's nothing. His hat was gone. I forgot that that edition was in there. Also, just like, yeah, it's trying to rope in this big fantasy world shit that like doesn't exist in this book and pretend like it's been here the whole time. And like that's fine, except for what it fundamentally does is take this sort of messy introduction to a world that is like brimming with possibility. And like I remember reading this and being like, the unrevised version obviously like in 15, 20 years ago, and being like, oh, what is this? Like what fundamentally is this? Like where is this going? I don't know. Because is the rest of the series gonna be? Is it gonna be a western? Is it gonna be? Well, and it was like partially just personal thing, right? My biological dad gifted me this. He he the only things he basically ever gifted me in terms of books that I remember, at least at the like near the end of his life, was the Gunslinger and some books in the Stephen R. Donaldson Covenant series, which I read the first one of those. I was like, this is the rapiest shit I've ever read in my life, and I have no interest in continuing. But like he was not a big reader, but like a Western person. So I had in my mind like, okay, this is like a 7 novel Western book with some weird King Arthur shit kind of hiding in the background. Like I need to figure this out. If you read the revised version, it's extremely clear that this is a high fantasy novel that for a little bit is going to pretend to be a western, and then it's going to go do some other stuff. And it's just not nearly as intriguing, or I can't imagine it to be. The other side of this, right, of course, is that the books, they fundamentally cover, or they have the same shape, they cover the same tracks. The incident in Tull is still told in a really horrifying way, even though it's meddled with a little bit in a way that I find annoying. But that's, come see, come saw, whatever. The problem I have with the revision is it fundamentally takes what I think is a brilliant thing that was able to like kick start my imagination in a way that like honestly no king has since or did before, and very few fantasy things. I mean, like I probably read a shit ton of Shannara before that, which is another thing that like I mean Shannara is sort of like prototypically like high fantasy trash, right? But also that's that first book. You're immediately in a world where they're like, yeah, there's like a nuclear suitcase, like a nuclear briefcase. I think at one point there's like D20s floating around in there, but like I don't know. It it was a fucking bummer to read because I think it one sure some of the language in the original is like over the top and like unclear because of its pretentious 19-year-oldness, whatever, right? I will take that any day over plotting period by period over most dull sentences one can write. It was white and blinding, and we're like, come on, like, it's just not interesting to read. And so that coupled with the fact that it is a what the fundamental structure of it is a regenreing of the thing, because it's not clean in its genre lines initially. I want the unclean lines. I want it to be like, where could this go? Not, so here's the world. We're gonna right by it. We're gonna stick right by it. Everything is gonna fall in line. Everything's gonna fall. Like, also, guess what? It doesn't. Spoilers for the Dark Tower series, a franchise that famously just forgets shit constantly. Like, so yeah, the experiment was interesting. It was an interesting experiment, and I'm glad I did it, because now I know that I do not recommend the revised edition of the Dark Tower, or of the Gunslinger. And now I know, 4 times in, I still fucking love the Gunslinger, the unrevised version. I still think this book absolutely rips. Like, there's so many good scenes, and like, I don't know, I was probably like 14 when I first read it, and I probably had just started smoking weed, and probably the moment, it was maybe right before, but I was like in that kind of world. And I still think the fucking Blade of Grass thing is great, and I barely remember how it actually plays. I know there's like a lot, but like, I barely remember like what the lore part of it is. But the image of Roland fucking House of the Borderlandsing out into space, or like a fucking Olaf Stapleton character, like having to see the universe and like barely being able to comprehend it, like, I think that's good shit. I don't know. It works for me, and I think it's cheapened when it is in the service of pretending as though this was all part of a big master plan the whole time, and that's a bummer. It was also a great reading experience, but it was also a bummer. That's books, baby. Okay. Thanks for not watching.